Hi guys, this is Hannah,
And this is Chelsea.
and we are doing our cultural presentation on Mexico. So, we wanted to start by talking about the history of Mexico. The Olmec were the first known people to live in Mexico. Little remains today of their civilization, and they disappeared around 400 BC. They were replaced by several different groups, as you can see here, such as the Mayan, the Aztecs, the Toltecs. And these civilizations had achievements in mathematics, astronomy, architecture. Some of their ruins still exist throughout the country. And one achievement that many of us know of is the Mayan calendar. So then in 1519, Cortez came from Spain and was able to conquer the country using a mixture of terror and persuasion. He gained control of the major Aztec city in 1521, thus making Mexico a colony of Spain. Things existed like this for several years until 1810, when Mexico rebelled against Spain and gained independence. Then, in 1846, the Mexican-American War began. It all started when President James K. Polk was elected in 1845, and he made a proposition to the Mexican government to purchase disputed lands between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. But the Mexican government rejected that offer. So Polk moved troops into the disputed territory, which then caused several small attacks that escalated into the Mexican-American War. In 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, ending the war in favor of the United States. The treaty added about an additional 525,000 square miles to United States territory, including the land that makes up all or parts of present-day Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. Mexico also gave up claims to Texas and recognized the Rio Grande as America's southern boundary. So current-day Mexico, the official name for the country is Los Estados Unidos de Mexico. The capital city is Mexico City, which is part of a District Federal, similar to Washington, D.C. in the U.S. It is the largest Spanish-speaking country in the world, bordered by the U.S. and then Guatemala and Belize. And they also have a growing middle class, which we'll talk about a little bit more in further slides.
So when looking at Mexico and the relationship between the United States, it's important to realize that the long border between the two countries means that peace and security for both the countries mutually relies on the peace and security at this border. When looking at the relationship between Mexico and the U.S. currently, after this current election, about 65% of Mexicans have a negative view of the U.S., with only 30% having a positive view. Some things that have led to the deterioration of the relationship between the U.S. and Mexico most recently was President Trump repealing NAFTA. NAFTA is the North American Free Trade Agreement, and it allowed for free trade between Canada, U.S., and Mexico. A lot of economists have speculated that the repeal of this trade agreement is going to have a lot of unintended consequences for the U.S., including reduced access to some of the U.S.'s biggest export markets, a reduction in economic growth, and an increased prices for gasoline, cars, fruits, and vegetables. Other things that have put strains on U.S.-Mexican relations include this increasing desire to build a wall and to force Mexican-American immigrants out of our country.
So some of the perceptions and biases that many Americans have regarding the Mexican people include that they're all illegal immigrants, criminals, that they bring drugs into our country, and that they're a drain on U.S. society and finances. Not all of these are true. As you can see in this chart, there are, out of 11 million unauthorized immigrants, and those are all unauthorized immigrants, not just those from Mexico, only 2.7% have been convicted of a felony. So that's a really small percentage. And only 7.5% in total have been convicted of a crime. So that kind of dispels that, that bias. Another thing to think about is that Mexicans may no longer be the majority of U.S. unauthorized immigrants. They made up half of all unauthorized immigrants in 2016, which is the first time in at least a decade that they did not account for a clear majority of this population. And I think that's because from 2009 to 2015, the number of unauthorized immigrants from other places, such as Asia and Central America, was rising. 59% of all unauthorized immigrants live in California, Texas, Florida, New York, New Jersey, and Illinois. Going back to that perception of them being a drain on U.S. society and finances, most unauthorized immigrants, they're overrepresented in farming and construction occupations, but in all industries and occupations, U.S.-born workers still outnumber unauthorized immigrants. So, really important, about 60% of the unauthorized population has been here for at least a decade. That a third of undocumented immigrants who are 15 years and older live with at least one child who is a United States citizen by birth, and slightly more than 30% own homes. So they're very committed to being here. Some of the socio-demographics of Mexico, it's primarily Spanish-speaking, 92% speak Spanish, and then the rest is a mix of both Spanish and indigenous languages. Some people who speak both, some people who only speak indigenous languages. The median age of the country is 28 years old, and as you can see from this graph, most of the population falls below 60. Mexico's economy has become increasingly oriented toward manufacturing since NAFTA in 1994, and per capita income is roughly 1/3 of that of the U.S. But approximately 46.2% of the population remains under the poverty line. So, again, like Chelsea said, NAFTA has been repealed by President Trump, and so there is a lot of speculation about what that will do both to our economy and to Mexico's economy, which in the past years has focused a lot on industries such as iron and steel, petroleum, motor vehicles. So NAFTA could really impact their economy.
So some of the pertinent health data when looking at Mexico that we were able to find online included mean life expectancy. So in Mexico, the mean life expectancy for an average adult is about 75.9 years. Their obesity rates are approximately 27.8%. Some of the adult risk factors identified per WHO, the World Health Organization, included tobacco use, which was around 17%, with approximately 27% of males using tobacco and only 8% of females using tobacco. And we'll talk about some of the cultural influences that contribute to these rates a little bit later in the presentation, but alcohol consumption was high for the Mexican population, with approximately 7.2 liters of alcohol being consumed annually, with the majority of this being consumed by males versus females, disproportionately actually. And lastly, one of the other risk factors for this population included hypertension, which was right around 22.8% identified in the population, with males being higher than females, but females still being competitively high with males in this category. And then just this chart kind of just looks at mortality rates and what they're caused by, and you can see a large proportion of them are from cardiovascular disease, diabetes, but then a large chunk of the pie also goes to communicable disease, maternal issues, perinatal issues, injuries. So I thought that was just an interesting slide to look at, and that was taken from the World Health Organization as well. So when looking at women's health specifically, as of 2015, it's estimated approximately 38 deaths per 100,000 live births. So Mexico's ranked 108th globally, and looking at this chart here, you can see that they do fall a little bit higher than the U.S., but as we all know, the U.S. doesn't do great as well. Looking at infant mortality rates, there are approximately 11.9 deaths per 1,000 live births, and they are ranked 123rd globally. And the mean age for the first birth is right around 21.3 years old, and approximately 72% of their population, their female population, does use contraception. And the average amount of children per woman in Mexico is about 2.24 children per woman.
So, Mexico is really a unique mix of ethnic groups. The Mestizo, which is an Amerindian and Spanish group, accounts for 62% of the population. Amerindian people, or predominantly Amerindian people, account for 21%, while 10% of the population is white. So these groups create a diverse mix that creates a culture that is unique to Mexico. Interestingly enough, the word chocolate is derived from the language of the Aztecs, and the Mayans had a goddess of chocolate, so that's another important contribution. And they're the second most Catholic country in the world, the first most being Brazil.
So this is just a quick slide that I wanted to put about diversity. Just piggybacking off what Hannah said, there is quite an array of colors and different types of people that live in Mexico. I included some pictures. This is my uncle and my aunt, and they moved here probably 20 years ago from Mexico City. He has bright red hair. This is his daughter. She's 100% Mexican, and you would never know it. Some other important people like Uma Thurman, and this girl, I'm told she's a celebrity. I'm not sure her name, but you can see that it's a far departure from kind of this stereotypical indigenous-looking Mexican woman that a lot of people perceive as Mexican. So just to be cautious when generalizing Mexican culture. So when we're looking at food, the Mexican cuisine is a blend of indigenous and Spanish influences, but many Mexicans continue to eat their native types of food. The staples of Mexican diet really includes corn. It's been found in Mexico for thousands of years. It's in almost every single meal in the form of a tortilla, but it also can be used in corn stew called pozole, which is this picture up here. Fruits and vegetables are really popular. This is mango with chili down here. Also, other vegetables they use include tomatoes, squash, sweet potatoes, avocados, nopales, which is cactus. They predominantly eat chicken and pork, and they use a variety of chili and other spices, including cilantro, thyme, cumin, cinnamon, and cloves. And just when caring for these patients, I think it's important to know, especially when counseling pregnant women, is to discuss healthy eating with them, because a lot of times Mexican women will consume 7 to 8 tortillas a day. This can put them, because of the high carbohydrate content in tortillas, this can be put them at higher risk for excessive weight gain, possibly gestational diabetes, and also talking about limiting soda and juice. Anymore, Coca-Cola has really become a stronghold in a lot of Mexican homes, and there's also this misconception that juice is healthy because it's from a fruit. So a lot of times what I've seen specifically speaking about my patient population at SEMA, is that they drink juice and they think it's healthy because it's from fruit, but they're drinking that 3-4 times a day, and they're gestational diabetics. They don't really, there's a little bit of a disconnect. So keeping that in mind as an important educational point for your patients. So when looking at music, mariachi, ranchera, norteño, they're like the most traditional types of music, and they use a variation of violins, trumpets, accordions, and they typically sing about love, passion, and patriotism. This is Vicente Fernandez, and he's extremely popular in Mexican culture. Like, women come and cry at his feet. He is it. So this is just a quick little blurb about Mexican music.
So the art of Mexico, like the rest of the country, is a very diverse mix. Mexico is a country with a lot of biodiversity, so it has several different types of clay, metals, wood, fibers, dyes, leading to a lot of different mediums in pottery, wood carving, paper mache, things like that. They often use very vibrant colors, and like I said, it's a mix between the indigenous culture and aspects that were brought over when the Spanish came over. Two very well-known artists are Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo. Diego was very influential in painting murals. He helped to begin the Mexican mural movement. And he also painted in some cities in the United States. And Frida mostly painted self-portraits. She's seen as promoting feminism and Mexican indigenous culture through her work. And they were actually, the two of those artists were married off and on. They had a very tumultuous relationship.
So moving on to, I think, one of the biggest takeaway points for this presentation is religion. So the Spaniards brought Catholicism to Mexico, and today it's seen that 85 to 95% of the Mexican people identify as a Roman Catholic. The Roman Catholic Church has been present since 1519, and this picture here represents the Virgin de Guadalupe. And when understanding what the Virgin signifies to the Mexican people, it's important to note that around 1531, it's said that the Virgin de Guadalupe appeared to Juan Diego, who was an indigenous man, and she appeared to him on Teopac Hill, which now today there's a huge shrine. And since then, the country has had a strong affinity towards the Virgin, and it has become a symbol of Catholicism in Mexico and many other Latin American countries as well. It was important to Mexicans because she presented herself to an indigenous man, and she's thought to be the symbol of the blending of Spanish and indigenous cultures found in Mexico, and is highly regarded too as the force that helped blend these two cultures to make one Mexican identity. She's currently the patron saint of Mexico, and her birthday is December 12th, where she's widely celebrated throughout the country. So I think when thinking about religion, especially in the setting of women's health, I think it's important to consider Catholic dogma, ideologies, and theology when caring for these patients. I think that asking yourself questions like, how will this affect the way they view abortion? How will this affect the way they view contraception, miscarriage, death and dying? I think these are all important conversations to have with your patients. They will vary from patient to patient, but having this underlying knowledge of idea that, Catholicism is generally a pro-life religion, and abortion is typically seen as sinful. So having those discussions with your patients in a culturally humble way would be extremely important. So when looking at the birth rituals and beliefs, Mexicans really feel that being pregnant is a gift, and it's highly regarded in their culture. When speaking with pregnant Mexican women, it's important to know that culturally, they feel that women should rest, eat well, take walks, but also there's a large and there's a lot of family involvement in this time in a woman's life. Many times their mothers or the mother-in-law will come to the home and stay for many months to, getting closer to the time of birth to help the woman prepare, to clean the house, to cook, to take care of any of the other children, to help her husband, to help the woman because, it's a really special time for the entire family. One contribution that I think that many of us are familiar with is the rebozo. So the rebozo is a traditional Mexican shawl, and it's used typically for laboring women. It's a way that they can use like counter pulling and pressure during labor, and it also can be used in a technique called sifting, which is thought to relax the pelvic musculature during labor and help birth progression. And so this is definitely has become increasingly popular here in the U.S. even. So when looking at birth in Mexican culture, birth is often attended by an experienced older woman to help the expecting mom. It's a common practice for the mom and the family to be around, but mainly it's only women involved in the birth. In rural Mexico today, a lot of women choose to have midwives attend their deliveries, and you can see here that we found a number that approximately 50% of deliveries in Mexico are attended by midwives. And I think overall there's this cultural feeling for non-intervention and shying away from augmentation of labor for fear of, poor outcomes and other complications. In the postpartum period, women typically have 40 days for recuperation after delivery, and the family makes home remedies and other types of herbal supplements for the woman to help cleanse her of the quote-unquote impurities of birth. They feel that if these rituals are carried out where they consume the herbs and they're cleansed of impurities, that postpartum depression should not occur. So this might just be a teaching point for women and their families to be like, hey, I understand you believe this, but if you're still feeling sad, if you're still feeling overwhelmed, like there are other things that we can do to help you. So this might just be a good conversation to have. And some of the interesting superstitions that I found relating to birth rituals, and their beliefs are, if a woman is pregnant during an eclipse, it can cause a cleft palate, so she should carry a safety pin or a key. And then this superstition of mal de ojo, which is like this fear that babies can get this kind of like evil eye from excessive admiration or covetous looks. So you don't even have to touch the child, but if you're admiring them too much from afar, then you can taint the child in some way. Breastfeeding women who become pregnant with a subsequent pregnancy while breastfeeding their current child feel that their milk becomes less potent and less nutritious, so they tend to stop breastfeeding and use bottles or, start bottle feeding their children. So I think this would also be another great point of education to inform the women that you can continue to breastfeed. It doesn't take away any type of nutrition for the baby that you're breastfeeding currently. That's about what we have. So moving on to women and machismo within Mexican culture. So in general and historically, Mexican culture places a high value on this quote-unquote manliness. They feel that women should be submissive and dependent of men, and that men have this strong obligation to be the manly man and to bring home the bacon, so to speak, and to be strong and virile and conquest women. So while this has been changing currently in Mexican culture, they still have a far way to go when it comes to this idea of machismo and women's rights. So it's felt that women and men have very defined roles, and that women should typically be at home with the family, cooking, cleaning, and abiding by what their husband says, while men go out and drink, gamble, and catcall, and do the hard manual labor and the work. So a lot of progressive women's right advocates within Mexico have been calling for a change to this type of poor treatment of women. And I was reading in a BBC article that talks about machismo specifically, and it states that 6 women daily die of violent death in Mexico. Violence against women has progressed to the point of femicide, where women are killed just because they're women. Domestic violence is widespread throughout Mexico, and it's really perpetuated by the historical and cultural norms of machismo. It's, this article also referred to that about 9 in 10 women have been subjected to sexual violence, whether it's on the streets or it's in the home by their own husband. And, I think that they brought up a really important point, is that even men who feel that this is morally wrong, their society puts such societal, like these really heavy pressures on them to function as a manly man, that, they are then chastised if they don't treat their woman at a certain level. So the main takeaway points and important things that I think it's really important in this aspect to be aware of would be screening all of your patients for interpersonal violence and domestic violence. Be suspicious of abnormal bruising patterns, missed appointments, and this should be a regular screening that you're performing. Also, just one point is that immigrant and migrant women are especially vulnerable because of they're constantly moving. It could be hard to keep tabs on them. So I think that this is a huge way that we can really empower Mexican women, but also to protect them as well. So lastly, talking about death and dying in Mexican culture. So generally, while death is feared and respected, it's thought to be an inevitable part of the natural cycle, and it's logical, just as birth and life is. They feel that death isn't, welcomed, and it's a necessary road that all souls must take. Additionally, Mexicans believe that in death, that life is not ending. However, it continues, and the deceased carry on to another world. And this is really just a blending of Aztec cultures and principles from Catholicism as well. Catholics believe that there's heaven and there's life after death. And when looking at Aztec cultures, the Aztecs believed that there was another world as well. So death is not regarded to as this final chapter for people. One cultural aspect that I'm sure many of you have become familiar with is the Dia de los Muertos, which is considered a feast day that happens November 1st and 2nd. And it's a day where Mexicans feel that their loved ones can come back to Earth and enjoy the things that they've been missing, from having an earthly existence. So they prepare elaborate meals, they have parades, they have music, and they serenade graves, they put out sweet treats, and they still have really huge festivals celebrating this. And one place they do a big Dia de los Muertos, celebration, so to speak, is in Guanajuato and in Michoacan. So this Day of the Dead is really linked with indigenous cultures, but like I said, Catholicism does play into these rituals as well. And then just some caveats to this is that Mexican Americans who predominantly grew up in the U.S. May have more of a North American view about death and dying, and I think that, caution and avoiding generalization and stereotyping is always important, and having a conversation with your patients about how they feel about death is extremely important, and I think can be beneficial to everybody. So thanks for listening. This is our presentation on culture. These are our references.